The year was 1487, and the town square of Rothenburg ob der Tauber had been transformed into an amphitheater of holy terror. A wooden platform rose from cobblestones slick with morning dew, and something darker, the stains of previous judgments that had sanctified this ground with blood spilled in God's name. Upon this stage of sanctioned violence stood a woman whose very presence seemed to mock the fury surrounding her. Elara Blackthorne appeared neither as the cowering wretch nor the defiant sorceress that the assembled crowd expected. She was perhaps 60 years of age, her silver hair braided with a dignity that the iron shackles around her wrists could not diminish. Her eyes, pale blue as winter sky, surveyed the sea of accusers with neither fear nor contempt, but with a kind of patient sadness that suggested she had long anticipated this moment. The multitude pressed forward like a living thing, hungry for spectacle, their faces twisted by religious fervor and something more primitive, the intoxicating thrill of witnessing another's destruction. They shouted accusations in voices hoarse from similar gatherings, "Witch, heretic, servant of Satan." Yet beneath their holy outrage lurked whispers of a different nature, rumors that spoke not of supernatural evil, but of earthly wealth beyond imagination. At the platform's edge stood Inquisitor Malleus Voss, a man whose gaunt frame and hollow cheeks spoke of austere dedication to his divine calling. His black robes, pristine despite the chaos surrounding him, bore the silver cross that marked his authority to judge souls and determine fates. But those who looked closely might have noticed how his fingers lingered on the ornate rings that adorned his hands, how his eyes glittered with something that transcended mere religious zeal. "Behold!" Malleus intoned, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "The woman who has trafficked with darkness, who has accumulated wealth through means forbidden to righteous Christians. See how she stands silent, offering no prayers for salvation, no pleas for mercy. For what defense can evil offer against the light of divine justice?" The crowd roared its approval, but Elara remained unmoved. Her silence was not the stunned paralysis of the guilty, nor the desperate calculation of the trapped. It was the profound quiet of someone who possessed knowledge that transcended the moment's hysteria, secrets that made the accusations swirling around her seem as insignificant as the buzzing of flies. How, the careful observer might wonder, had a treasure become more dangerous than witchcraft itself? How had gold proven more damning than any compact with Satan? The answer lay not in the supernatural realm that so obsessed the gathered faithful, but in the very human realm of greed masquerading as godliness, of avarice wearing the mask of divine justice. For Inquisitor Malleus had discovered something in Elara's cottage that challenged everything he thought he understood about wealth, power, and the mysterious ways in which fortune could transform even the most devoted servant of God into something far more sinister than any witch could ever hope to become. The Holy Roman Empire in the late 15th century had become a landscape where fear walked openly through every street and suspicion poisoned every well.
The Malleus Maleficarum, that infamous manual of witch hunting, had been published just 2 years prior, providing theological justification for horrors that previous generations had considered barbaric. What had once been local suspicions and village gossip had been systematized into a machinery of persecution that operated with the efficiency of a military campaign. In the German states, where political fragmentation created countless small jurisdictions eager to demonstrate their piety, the witch trials had become a form of competitive devotion. Each principality sought to outdo its neighbors in the zealousness with which it purged heretical influences, creating a market for professional inquisitors who traveled from region to region, leaving trails of ashes and empty coffers in their wake. Rothenburg ob der Tauber, despite its prosperity as a trading center, had not escaped the contagion of supernatural terror.
The town's wealth, built upon commerce and craft guilds, had created social tensions that the witch hysteria seemed perfectly designed to address. Successful merchants found themselves accused of demonic pacts when their prosperity exceeded that of their neighbors. Skilled craftsmen were denounced for possessing knowledge too advanced for mortal understanding. Widows who had inherited property became prime targets for accusations that would conveniently transfer their assets to more deserving and male hands. It was into this world of systematized paranoia that Elara Blackthorne had lived her quiet existence, occupying a cottage at the town's periphery where she practiced the ancient arts of herbalism and healing. Her knowledge of plants and their properties had made her invaluable to women seeking remedies for ailments they could not discuss with male physicians. Her skill with numbers had made her useful to merchants who needed accounts balanced and contracts interpreted. Her ability to read and write in multiple languages had connected her with scholars and travelers from across Europe.
But these very talents that had once made her valuable had gradually transformed into sources of suspicion as the witch hysteria intensified. Knowledge itself had become suspect, particularly when possessed by women who lived independently of male authority. Elara's refusal to remarry after her husband's death 20 years earlier had marked her as unnatural in a society where women were expected to pass from father's authority to husband's protection without pause. More troubling still was her apparent prosperity despite her unmarried state. The cottage she inhabited was well maintained, her clothes were of fine quality, and she seemed never to lack for food or fuel, even during the harshest winters. In a world where poverty was considered the natural state of the virtuous, such comfort without obvious means of support suggested supernatural assistance. Inquisitor Malachias had arrived in Rothenburg 3 months earlier, summoned by local authorities who had grown concerned about the persistence of heretical practices despite their efforts at spiritual purification. His reputation preceded him, a man of iron faith who had successfully prosecuted witches in Bavaria, Swabia, and the Rhineland, leaving behind him a trail of purified communities and filled treasuries. For Malachias possessed a particular genius for identifying witches whose confessions would not only satisfy spiritual justice, but also provide material benefits to the communities that employed his services. His investigations invariably focused on individuals whose elimination would result in the redistribution of wealth from questionable sources to more deserving recipients. typically including generous fees for his own valuable services. The system had worked flawlessly throughout his career. Accused witches, faced with the choice between confession and increasingly creative forms of persuasion, would eventually admit to supernatural compacts that explained their suspicious prosperity. Their property, tainted by association with evil, would be confiscated by church authorities and redistributed to support the community's spiritual welfare. Justice was served, heresy was eliminated, and everyone, except the accused, benefited from the purification process. Elara Blackthorne, however, had proven remarkably resistant to this well-established procedure. Despite weeks of investigation, questioning, and increasingly pointed encouragement, she had admitted to nothing more than the healing practices that everyone already knew she performed. She showed no signs of supernatural knowledge, no evidence of demonic familiar, no indication of the sexual depravity that supposedly accompanied witchcraft. What she did possess, as Malachias discovered during his search of her cottage, was a mystery far more intriguing and potentially profitable than any compact with Satan could ever prove to be.
The search of Elara's cottage had begun as a routine procedure, the kind of methodical investigation that Malachias had conducted hundreds of times in his career as an inquisitor. He expected to find the usual evidence of heretical practice, books of forbidden knowledge, implements for casting spells, ingredients for unholy potions, or correspondence with known practitioners of the dark arts. What he discovered instead challenged not only his assumptions about Elara Blackthorne, but his entire understanding of how wealth could exist in the world. The cottage itself was modest in scale, but extraordinary in its appointments. The furniture, while simple in design, was crafted from woods that Malachias recognized as exotic: ebony from Africa, teak from the Indies, cedar from the Holy Land. The fabrics were of qualities that exceeded what most nobles could afford. Silk that seemed to capture light and hold it, wool so fine it felt like liquid between his fingers, linen woven with threads of silver that created patterns visible only from certain angles. But these luxuries, impressive though they were, paled before the discovery that would reshape Malachias's understanding of the case entirely. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage's main room, secured within a chest whose craftsmanship suggested origins far older than any contemporary guild could produce, lay a collection of treasures that defied every assumption about medieval wealth. The gold alone was staggering, not merely in quantity, though there was enough to ransom kingdoms, but in its variety and obvious antiquity. Coins bearing the images of Roman emperors dead for 1,000 years lay alongside Byzantine solidi that gleamed as if newly minted. Islamic dinars with Arabic inscriptions nestled against Frankish tremises, while at the collection's heart lay specimens that Malachias could not identify at all, coins bearing symbols that seemed to predate Christianity itself. The jewelry was even more mysterious. Rings and bracelets displayed workmanship that exceeded anything produced in contemporary Europe, incorporating techniques that modern craftsmen claimed were impossible. Gems were cut in fashions that created optical effects unknown to current lapidaries, while settings employed alloys that seemed to resist the tarnish that afflicted normal metals. Most puzzling of all were the manuscripts, not grimoires or books of spells, as Malachias had hoped to discover, but commercial documents written in languages he could not identify, using symbols that resembled no script he had encountered in his extensive travels. The parchment itself was strange, neither vellum nor paper, but something that felt neither and seemed proof against both age and damage.
As Malachias catalogued these treasures, his trained mind began calculating their total value. The gold alone represented more wealth than most kingdoms possessed in their treasuries. The jewelry could finance armies or purchase entire duchies. The manuscripts, if they contained the commercial secrets they appeared to record, might be worth more than all the rest combined. But the true revelation came not from the treasure's value, but from its implications. How had an unmarried woman living in a modest cottage acquired wealth that exceeded that of emperors? Where had these ancient coins originated, and how had they remained in such perfect condition? What techniques had created jewelry whose craftsmanship surpassed anything available in the modern world? The obvious explanation that Elara had indeed made supernatural compacts to acquire her wealth should have satisfied Malachias completely. Here was evidence of diabolic association more convincing than any confession could provide. The case should have concluded with a swift trial, a foregone conviction, and the redistribution of cursed treasure to more deserving hands. But as Malachias examined the hoard more closely, his professional skepticism began to assert itself. In his years of prosecuting witches, he had encountered every form of supernatural fraud imaginable. He had seen fake grimoires created to support false accusations, staged evidence planted to incriminate innocent victims, and manufactured miracles designed to either implicate or exonerate the accused. Yet this treasure showed none of the signs of fabrication he had learned to recognize. The antiquity was genuine, the craftsmanship authentic, the value unmistakable. If this was fraud, it was fraud on a scale and of a sophistication that exceeded anything he had encountered in decades of professional investigation. More troubling still was Elara's reaction to the discovery. She had watched him uncover her secret hoard with neither the defiant pride of a witch confronting her inquisitor, nor the terrified despair of someone caught in damning evidence. Instead, she had observed his amazement with what appeared to be sad resignation, as if the treasure's discovery was not a catastrophe, but merely the inevitable conclusion of a story whose ending she had long foreseen. "You do not understand what you have found," she had said, speaking for the first time since his investigation began. Her voice carried none of the theatrical menace he associated with diabolical servants, nor the pleading desperation of the falsely accused. Instead, it held the weary patience of someone forced to explain complex matters to a child. "Then enlighten me," Malachias had replied, his own voice carefully controlled despite the excitement coursing through his veins. "Explain how a simple herbalist comes to possess treasures that would make kings weep with envy." Elara's response had been to lapse back into the silence that characterized all her subsequent interactions. She had refused to explain the treasure's origins, refused to confess to supernatural assistance, refused even to acknowledge that anything unusual required explanation. Her silence was not the stubborn defiance of the guilty,
but something far more unnerving. The quiet of someone who knew that the truth was more complex and more dangerous than any lie could ever be. It was this silence that had convinced Malachias that whatever secret lay behind Elara's wealth was worth discovering, even if the discovery required methods more creative than his usual investigative procedures. The treasure was real, its value beyond calculation, and its acquisition clearly beyond the normal means of a cottage herbalist. The question was not whether Elara Blackthorne deserved prosecution. The treasure's existence was evidence enough of supernatural involvement to justify any proceeding. The question was whether Malachias could extract from her the knowledge that would allow him to acquire not just her hoard, but the secret of how such wealth could be accumulated. For the first time in his career, the Inquisitor found himself more interested in learning from his victim than in simply eliminating her. The witch trial that followed would be unlike any he had conducted before, driven not by the desire to purge heresy, but by the hunger to possess mysteries that promised wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. The construction of a case against Elara Blackthorne required all of Malachias's considerable expertise in the manufacture of supernatural evidence. Unlike his previous prosecutions, where genuine local suspicions provided the foundation for elaborate theological arguments, this case demanded the creation of diabolic associations from whole cloth. The treasure alone, while certainly suspicious, was not sufficient to guarantee conviction. He needed a narrative that would satisfy both legal requirements and popular expectations. His first step was to recruit witnesses whose testimony would establish a pattern of supernatural activity surrounding Elara's cottage. This proved surprisingly difficult, as the woman had lived quietly among her neighbors for 2 decades without creating the usual catalog of unexplained misfortunes that marked genuine witch infestations. Children who played near her garden suffered no mysterious illnesses. Crops planted adjacent to her property showed no signs of blight, and livestock that wandered onto her land displayed no subsequent behavioral abnormalities. Malachias solved this problem through the careful application of financial incentive and theological pressure. He began by identifying individuals within the community who harbored grievances against Elara. Former patients whose treatments had not produced immediate results, merchants whose services she had declined to employ, neighbors whose advances had been rejected with what they now claimed was supernatural disdain. To these natural sources of resentment, he added carefully crafted suggestions about the possible supernatural causes of various community misfortunes. The merchant, whose grain stores had been contaminated by rats, was encouraged to recall unusual behavior among the rodents following their exposure to Elara's property. The midwife, whose recent deliveries had resulted in difficult births, was reminded of Elara's presence at previous, more successful deliveries, and asked to consider the implications of this pattern. Most effectively, Malachias exploited the community's collective memory of events that had occurred before his arrival. A particularly harsh winter 3 years earlier was reinterpreted as evidence of weather manipulation. An outbreak of fever 2 summers past was reconsidered in light of Elara's herbal treatments.
treatments that had actually saved lives, but could be reframed as evidence of supernatural knowledge about diseases she might have caused herself. The process required weeks of careful cultivation, but gradually Malachias assembled a collection of witnesses whose testimony would paint a picture of decades-long supernatural influence. The beauty of this approach was its irrefutability. Events that had been interpreted as natural or beneficial at the time of their occurrence could be recontextualized as diabolic through the simple application of hindsight informed by proper theological understanding. Physical evidence proved easier to arrange. Malachias had learned through years of experience that popular imagination required tangible proof of supernatural activity. Abstract theological arguments might convince educated observers, but crowds demanded artifacts they could see and understand. He therefore set about creating the material culture of witchcraft that Elara's cottage had conspicuously lacked.
A collection of unusual herbs gathered from the surrounding countryside and arranged in patterns that suggested ritual use was discovered in Elara's garden during a follow-up search. Books of apparently heretical content, actually volumes of legitimate medical and astronomical knowledge, but written in languages that local observers could not read, were found hidden among her legitimate possessions. Wax figures bearing carved symbols were uncovered in locations that suggested their use in sympathetic magic targeting specific individuals. Each piece of evidence was carefully documented and presented to local authorities as confirmation of suspicions that the community's growing expertise in recognizing supernatural threats had made inevitable. The fact that none of these items had been discovered during the initial thorough search of Elara's property was explained as evidence of her skill in concealment, a skill that only intensive investigation guided by divine inspiration had been able to overcome.
The most crucial element of Malachias's fabrication was the creation of a supernatural explanation for Elara's wealth that would justify its confiscation while satisfying popular expectations about diabolic bargains. This required delicate theological maneuvering, as the Church's official position held that demons, being spiritual entities, could not create actual gold, but could only create the illusion of wealth that would eventually reveal itself as worthless. Malachias resolved this doctrinal difficulty by proposing that Elara's treasure represented not demonic creation, but demonic theft, gold and jewelry stolen by supernatural agents from their rightful owners across Europe and concentrated in her cottage as payment for services rendered. This explanation had the advantage of being both theologically sound and practically convenient, as it meant that the confiscated wealth was not cursed illusion, but legitimate treasure that could be safely redistributed. The narrative he constructed was masterful in its complexity and internal consistency. Elara had made her initial bargain with diabolic forces decades earlier, trading her soul for knowledge of herbs and healing that exceeded normal human capabilities. This supernatural wisdom had made her valuable to her community while creating the appearance of natural skill that concealed her true source of knowledge. As her reputation grew, so did the scope of her diabolic services. Demons acting at her direction
had begun stealing treasures from across Christendom, concentrating wealth in her cottage that served both as payment for her cooperation and as a center from which supernatural influence could radiate throughout the region. The harsh winter, the outbreak of fever, and other community misfortunes were not random events, but deliberate attacks orchestrated by forces whose ultimate goal was the corruption of an entire population. The beauty of this explanation was how it accounted for every aspect of the case, while providing clear justification for every action Malachias intended to take. Elara's apparent virtue was revealed as diabolic deception, her healing knowledge as supernatural corruption, her accumulated wealth as the proceeds of spiritual theft. Her prosecution was not merely justice, but holy war, and her treasure's confiscation was not seizure, but rightful recovery. Most importantly, the narrative placed Malachias himself in the role of divine instrument, the man whose theological expertise and investigative skill had uncovered a diabolic conspiracy that might otherwise have corrupted an entire region. His actions were not driven by personal ambition, but by sacred duty. His rewards not personal enrichment, but the just compensation due to one who had served God's cause with such distinction. With his case constructed and his evidence assembled, Malachias was ready to proceed to trial, confident that the outcome would satisfy every requirement of justice, theology, and practical necessity. The only remaining question was whether Elara herself would cooperate with the process by providing the confession that would validate his careful construction of her guilt.
As the trial proceedings intensified, Malachias began to experience phenomena that challenged his rational understanding of the case he had so carefully constructed. What began as minor inconveniences, headaches during important meetings, difficulty sleeping after particularly intensive interrogation sessions, gradually evolved into manifestations that seemed to confirm the supernatural dimensions of Elara's case in ways he had never intended. The first sign of trouble came during his private examination of the confiscated treasure. As Malachias handled the ancient coins and mysterious jewelry, he began experiencing visions that seemed to emerge from the objects themselves. Touching a Byzantine solidus would trigger images of Constantinople in its imperial glory, complete with sounds, smells, and physical sensations that left him exhausted and disoriented. Handling Islamic dinars produced visions of desert cities and caravan routes, while the unidentifiable ancient coins transported him to civilizations that seemed to predate recorded history. Initially, Malachias attributed these experiences to overwork and the natural stress of conducting such a complex prosecution, but as the visions intensified and became more specific, he began to suspect that the treasure itself possessed properties that extended beyond mere material value. The objects seemed to carry within them the memories of their origins, imprinting their history upon anyone who handled them with sufficient sensitivity. More disturbing were the dreams that began visiting him nightly, visions that seemed to reveal the true story behind Elara's wealth in ways that contradicted everything he had constructed about her supposed diabolic associations. In these nocturnal revelations, he saw not a woman who had bargained with demons, but someone who had inherited knowledge and treasures from sources far older and more mysterious than Christian theology could easily accommodate.
The dreams showed him Elara as a young woman, apprenticed to an ancient woman whose knowledge encompassed not only herbal lore, but understanding of civilizations that had flourished and vanished before the Roman Empire was conceived. This mysterious mentor had possessed not supernatural powers, but accumulated wisdom, the distilled knowledge of cultures that had explored sciences and philosophies unknown to medieval Europe. The treasure, these visions suggested, was not stolen gold, but inherited wealth, the accumulated capital of trading networks that had operated for millennia, connecting civilizations across continents in commerce that had created and preserved wealth in forms that contemporary Europe could barely comprehend. Elara had not acquired her riches through diabolic bargains, but through inheritance from predecessors who had understood economic principles that would not be rediscovered for centuries.
As these revelations accumulated, Malachias found his carefully constructed case beginning to collapse under the weight of a far more complex and disturbing truth. The woman he was prosecuting for witchcraft appeared to be guilty of nothing more than possessing knowledge and resources that challenged the fundamental assumptions of his world. Her silence in the face of accusations was not defiance or supernatural protection, but the patient endurance of someone who understood that the truth was too complex for her accusers to accept or comprehend. Worse still, Malachias began to recognize that his own obsession with Elara's wealth was producing exactly the kind of moral and spiritual corruption that his theological training had taught him to associate with genuine diabolic influence. His sleep was disturbed not by supernatural visitations, but by guilt over his systematic perversion of justice in service of personal greed. His health was deteriorating, not because of curses, but because of the stress of maintaining lies that grew more elaborate and more morally indefensible with each passing day. The true curse, he began to realize, was not associated with Elara's treasure, but with his own desperate desire to possess it. His fabrication of evidence, manipulation of witnesses, and perversion of theological doctrine had transformed him from an instrument of divine justice into something far more sinister. A man whose greed had made him willing to destroy an innocent woman for the sake of wealth he could never legitimately possess. This realization was confirmed when members of his own household began displaying signs of distress that mirrored his own deteriorating condition. His servants reported nightmares in which they were forced to participate in elaborate trials whose outcomes they knew to be unjust. His secretary began making errors in documentation that seemed designed to undermine the case they were constructing together. Even his horse showed signs of reluctance to carry him to the courthouse, as if the animal could sense the moral contamination that surrounded the proceedings.
Most damning was the behavior of his own family, who had remained in Bavaria during his extended stay in Rothenburg. Letters from his wife described dreams in which she saw him surrounded by piles of gold that transformed into serpents when touched. His children reported nightmares about their father being consumed by flames that burned without heat, creating light that revealed horrific transformations in familiar faces. These manifestations convinced Malachias that he was indeed dealing with supernatural forces, but not in the way he had originally imagined. The curse was not Elara's diabolic power turned against her accusers, but the natural consequence of his own moral corruption made manifest through psychological and spiritual channels. He had created his own damnation through choices that violated every principle he claimed to serve. The irony was exquisite and terrible. In his eagerness to prosecute a woman for supernatural crimes she had not committed, Malachias had committed crimes against divine and human law that were far more serious than any witchcraft could ever be. His fabrication of evidence constituted false witness. His manipulation of testimony violated judicial procedures, and his perversion of theological doctrine bordered on blasphemy. Yet, having committed himself so completely to the prosecution, he found himself trapped by his own deceptions. To abandon the case now would require admitting to fabrications that would destroy his reputation and likely result in his own prosecution for judicial misconduct. To continue required deepening his involvement in activities that were destroying his sanity, his health, and his spiritual welfare. The choice he faced was between personal destruction through confession or spiritual destruction through persistence in sin. Either path led to ruin, but one offered the possibility of redemption, while the other promised only continued corruption. As he contemplated this impossible decision, Malachias began to understand why Elara watched the proceedings with such patient sadness. She had foreseen this moment from the beginning, recognizing that his greed would ultimately prove far more destructive than any supernatural curse could ever be. The courtroom had become a theater where truth and falsehood waged war through the medium of legal procedure. But the real battle was being fought in the spiritual realm, where Malachias struggled against an enemy he was only beginning to recognize. As he pressed his case against Elara with increasing desperation, the Inquisitor found himself confronting not the diabolic conspiracy he had invented, but the far more terrifying reality of his own moral dissolution. Each day of testimony brought new evidence of the prosecution's fundamental corruption. Witnesses who had initially seemed credible began contradicting themselves under careful questioning, revealing the financial incentives and theological pressure that had shaped their accusations. Physical evidence that had appeared damning was exposed as recently planted, its artificial nature becoming obvious to observers who possessed the expertise to recognize authentic antiquity versus modern fabrication. Most damaging was the growing recognition among court officials that Malachias's theological arguments contained serious doctrinal errors that called into question his competence as an inquisitor. His explanation of how demons could accumulate genuine treasure contradicted established church teaching about the limitations of supernatural power. His interpretation of biblical passages related to witchcraft violated hermeneutical principles that any properly trained theologian should have respected. These revelations created political complications that threatened to extend far beyond the immediate case. Church authorities in Bavaria began receiving reports about their inquisitors' questionable methods and potentially heretical teachings. Secular officials in Rothenburg found themselves defending judicial procedures that appeared to violate both imperial law and local custom. The trial that was supposed to demonstrate the community's commitment to spiritual purity was instead creating scandals that undermined confidence in both ecclesiastical and temporal authority. Yet Malachias pressed forward with his prosecution, driven by a desperation that had transcended rational calculation.
The treasure in Elara's cottage represented not merely wealth, but validation, proof that his methods, however questionable, could produce results that justified any moral compromise necessary to achieve them. To abandon the case would mean admitting that his entire career had been built upon foundations of fraud and self-deception.
His strategy shifted from seeking confession to demanding revelation. If Elara would not admit to diabolic bargains, perhaps she could be persuaded to reveal the true source of her wealth in ways that would allow him to access similar resources. The interrogation sessions became increasingly focused on extracting practical information rather than theological admissions, as Malachias sought to learn the secrets that would make him independently wealthy, rather than merely convict another witch. This change in approach revealed the true nature of his obsession to everyone involved in the proceedings. Court observers recognized that the inquisitors' interest in the accused had little to do with concerns about spiritual purity and everything to do with greed that had grown beyond reason or restraint. The theological facade began crumbling as Malachias revealed motivations that were entirely worldly and profoundly corrupt. Elara's response to this intensified pressure was to maintain the patient silence that had characterized her demeanor throughout the proceedings. She answered questions about her herbal knowledge with technical precision that revealed genuine expertise, discussed her reading and writing skills in ways that demonstrated legitimate scholarship, and described her daily routines with detail that confirmed her essential ordinariness. But about the treasure's origins, she remained absolutely silent, offering no explanations that might satisfy her interrogator's hunger for secrets. Her silence was not passive resistance, but active protection, not of herself, for she seemed to have accepted that her fate was sealed regardless of her cooperation, but of knowledge that she understood to be dangerous in the wrong hands. The treasure represented not merely accumulated wealth, but accumulated wisdom, the distilled understanding of civilizations that had learned to create and preserve prosperity across centuries of political upheaval and cultural transformation. To reveal the source of such knowledge to someone like Malachias would be to risk its corruption and misuse in ways that could affect far more people than those immediately involved in the current proceedings. Her silence was an act of moral courage that sought to protect future generations from the consequences of wisdom placed in the service of uncontrolled greed. This protection extended to the trial proceedings themselves, where Elara's refusal to provide the confessions or revelations that Malachias demanded gradually exposed the prosecution's fundamental weakness. Without her cooperation, the case rested entirely upon fabricated evidence and coerced testimony that could not withstand careful scrutiny. The theological arguments became circular, the legal procedures became obviously corrupt, and the entire prosecution began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But perhaps most significantly, Elara's silent dignity in the face of obviously unjust persecution began to affect the observers whose support was essential for the trial's success. Community members who had initially supported the prosecution began questioning whether the proceedings represented justice or persecution. Church officials who had endorsed Malachias's methods started distancing themselves from activities that appeared to violate fundamental principles of canonical procedure. The conflict was approaching its climax, but not in the way that anyone had anticipated. Rather than ending with Elara's confession and conviction, the trial was moving toward a confrontation that would force everyone involved to choose between truth and convenience, between justice and expedience, between moral courage and personal advantage. The battle for Elara's treasure had become a battle for the souls of everyone involved in the proceedings, and the outcome would determine not only her fate, but the spiritual welfare of an entire community that had allowed itself to be seduced by the promise of easy wealth extracted through sanctified persecution.
The final day of Elara Blackthorne's trial dawned gray and cold, as if the very sky mourned what was about to unfold in the courthouse of Rottenburg ob der Tauber. The chamber was packed beyond capacity with observers who sensed that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Not merely another witch-burning, but a confrontation that would reveal truths too dangerous for comfortable belief. Malachias stood before the assembled court with the appearance of a man who had been consumed by his own ambitions. Weeks of sleepless nights and tormented days had left their mark on his gaunt features, while his eyes held the desperate gleam of someone who had wagered everything on a single, increasingly doubtful outcome. His final interrogation of Elara would determine not only her fate, but his own survival as an inquisitor whose methods had come under scrutiny from authorities who could no longer ignore the irregularities in his prosecution. "Elara Blackthorne," he began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "You have been accused of practicing witchcraft, of making bargains with diabolic forces, of accumulating wealth through supernatural means forbidden to righteous Christians. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The testimony of your neighbors is damning, and the treasure found in your possession speaks of associations that no innocent soul could explain. Yet still you remain silent. Still you offer no confession, no plea for mercy, no explanation that might save your immortal soul from the flames that await both your body and your spirit." Elara regarded him with those pale blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for weeks. And for the first time since her trial began, she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. "And what would you have me confess, Inquisitor? What words would satisfy the hunger that has consumed you so completely that you can no longer recognize the difference between justice and theft, between divine calling and mortal greed?" The question hung in the air, like an accusation more damning than any testimony the prosecution had presented. Murmurs rippled through the crowded chamber as observers recognized that the dynamic of the trial had suddenly shifted. The accused was no longer merely defending herself. She was challenging the very foundations upon which her persecution had been constructed.
Malachias felt something cold settle in his chest as he realized that Elara was about to reveal truths he was not prepared to hear. "Confess to your diabolic bargains," he demanded, his voice rising to cover the uncertainty that threatened to betray him. "Explain how you acquired wealth that exceeds the holdings of princes. Reveal the supernatural sources of knowledge that allowed you to heal diseases and predict events that should be known only to God." Elara's smile was sad and knowing. the expression of someone who had waited patiently for this moment while watching others destroy themselves through their own choices. The treasure you covet so desperately, Inquisitor, carries no curse except the one that exists in the hearts of those who would spill innocent blood to possess it. The gold you have convinced yourself is diabolic in origin was earned through commerce and learning by my ancestors, who understood truths about the world that your age has forgotten in its eagerness to explain everything through the lens of supernatural fear. She paused, allowing her words to penetrate the consciousness of everyone present before continuing with devastating precision. I am the last heir of the Blackthorne family, inheritors of knowledge preserved from the days when Alexandria's great library still stood, when scholars traveled freely between East and West, carrying wisdom that transcended the boundaries of any single faith or kingdom. The manuscripts you found are not grimoires, but commercial records, written in languages that predate your Latin, documenting trades that connected civilizations you have never imagined. The courtroom erupted in chaos as the implications of her revelation became clear. If Elara spoke the truth, then the entire prosecution had been built upon ignorance, masquerading as theological expertise. The treasure that had driven Malachius to fabricate evidence and suborn witnesses was not cursed gold, but legitimate inheritance, the accumulated wealth of generations who had prospered through knowledge and commerce rather than supernatural intervention.
But Elara was not finished. Her voice cut through the tumult with authority that commanded attention, even from those who wished to deny her words. The true curse in this chamber, Inquisitor, is the one you have brought upon yourself and all who have aided your corruption. You have perverted justice to serve greed, fabricated evidence to support lies, and violated every oath you swore when you accepted the authority to judge souls in God's name. The nightmares that torment you, the guilt that poisons your sleep, the fear that shadows your every moment, these are not supernatural visitations, but the natural consequences of choices that have transformed you from servant of divine will into an instrument of your own damnation. Malachius staggered, as if physically struck by her accusations. The truth she spoke was undeniable, but admitting it would mean confessing to crimes that carried penalties as severe as those he had sought to inflict upon her. Yet the alternative, continuing with a prosecution that everyone now recognized as fundamentally corrupt, offered no salvation either. "You lie," he whispered, but the words carried no conviction. "You seek to escape righteous judgment through elaborate deceptions designed to confuse the faithful and corrupt the innocent." Elara's response was to reach into her robes and produce a small object that she placed on the table before her. A simple ring whose appearance transformed everything that had gone before. The band was crafted from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, while the stone it held appeared to contain depths that defied the laws of optics. Most significantly, carved into the band in letters that predated Latin script was an inscription that those with sufficient learning could read: "Truth endures when lies crumble." This ring, Elara said quietly, was worn by scholars in Alexandria 1,500 years ago. It has passed down through my family not as a talisman of supernatural power,
but as a reminder that knowledge persists even when the civilizations that create it fall to ignorance and fear. I wear it now as testimony that truth will outlive the lies you have constructed, that justice will eventually prevail over the corruption you have brought to these proceedings, and that the real curse in this chamber is not diabolic influence, but the willingness of good people to participate in evil acts when promised sufficient reward.
The ring's appearance created a silence more profound than any testimony that had preceded it. Here was an artifact whose authenticity was immediately apparent to everyone present, whose origins clearly predated the Christian era, and whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between ancient wisdom and medieval faith. If Elara possessed such objects through legitimate inheritance, then everything Malachias had claimed about supernatural acquisition became suspect. More devastating still was the inscription's implicit prophecy about the trial's ultimate outcome. Truth would indeed endure when lies crumbled, but the implications of that endurance would destroy not only Malachias's case, but his entire career as an inquisitor whose methods could no longer withstand scrutiny from authorities who demanded higher standards of evidence and procedure. As Elara replaced the ring within her robes, her final words to the court carried the weight of judgment that transcended any earthly tribunal. I have lived my life in service of knowledge that seeks to heal rather than harm, wisdom that seeks to preserve rather than destroy, wealth that seeks to benefit many rather than elevate few. If such devotion to ancient learning constitutes witchcraft in your understanding, then I accept that judgment willingly. But know that the real evil in this chamber is not supernatural corruption, but the corruption of mortals who have allowed greed to master justice, fear to triumph over reason, and lies to masquerade as divine truth. The climax was complete. The moment of revelation had arrived not through Malachias' skilled interrogation, but through Elara's patient decision to speak truths that would transform not only her own fate, but the spiritual destiny of everyone who had participated in her persecution. The trial would continue, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was whether those involved would find the courage to choose truth over convenience, justice over expedience, redemption over continued corruption.